The conclusion of the summit earned praise from G20 members, including China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. But Ukraine was unhappy with the result. Jayne Codnita reports.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who represented President Vladimir Putin at the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi, praised the host country, India, which he claimed has helped to consolidate the countries of the Global South. According to Lavrov, India has managed to coalesce G20 members from the Global South. He also said that the Global South stood up to protect their legitimate interests, which made it possible to prevent the West from once again Ukrainizing the entire agenda of the G20 summit and diverting attention from the problems currently being faced by emerging economies. The Russian foreign minister also said that the New Delhi declarations mentioned in the Ukraine crisis are in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. He also thanked India for preventing attempts to politicize the G20. While the United Kingdom and the United States talked up the joint statement as well, Ukraine expressed disappointment with the outcome, saying that the G20 had nothing to be proud of. To recall, Ukraine was invited in the 2022 G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. However, it failed to receive an invitation from India. The G20 paved the way for talks between countries on the sidelines, and among them were talks between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi on Sunday. Both leaders successfully held face-to-face talks after a decade-long rift between their countries. Meanwhile, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud praised India for its successful G20 stewardship. Saudi Arabia and India also unveiled a major trade and transport route linking Europe, the Middle East, and India as part of a broad alliance between said countries. Following the conclusion of this year's G20 summit, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in a closing ceremony, handed a gavel to Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is set to take over the presidency of the bloc in December. Reporting, this has been Jayne Codnita, SMNI News.
The most controversial part of the G20 Delhi Declaration was probably the issue of Ukraine. But India managed to pull it off, and as a result, the declaration notably refrained from condemning Russia, acknowledging instead the differences among member nations regarding Ukraine conflict. Justine Nazario reports.
The G20 summit held in New Delhi concluded with a final declaration recognizing the lack of consensus among the world's major economies regarding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who hosted the summit, shared the news of the agreement on the final declaration with other world leaders. The disagreement over the Ukrainian issue had been a significant stumbling block in the summit's proceedings. Western nations had pushed for a strong condemnation of Russia's military actions in Ukraine, but this stance faced resistance from other G20 member states. In fact, the paragraph specifically addressing the geopolitical situation remained empty in the draft of declaration until the last moment. Despite the absence of Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the summit, the Western nations failed to sway the positions of the Global South countries regarding Ukraine crisis. A portion of the article also reaffirms that the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, although the bloc acknowledges that these issues can have significant consequences for the global economy. The final declaration acknowledged the human suffering and negative impacts of conflict on global food and energy security, supply chains, macro-financial stability, inflation, and economic growth. It emphasized that developing countries, which had already been grappling with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, were the most affected by the ongoing conflict. However, the declaration also pointed out that G20 member nations held different views and assessments of the situation concerning the Ukraine conflict. Despite these differences, world leaders pledged to come together to address the crisis' impact on the global economy. They also expressed their openness to supporting initiatives that promote a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, aligning with the principles outlined in the United Nations Charter. Reporting, this is Minister Nazario, SMNI News.
Press Secretary of the White House abruptly ended U.S. President Joe Biden's rambling during a press conference in Vietnam. Andrea Santos files this report.
Joe Biden concluded his first Asian trip as president with a press conference in Hanoi, Vietnam. However, it was marred by awkward jokes and rambling about the third world. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre abruptly ended Biden's press conference, cutting him off mid-sentence as he talked about the third world and his conversation with Chinese Premier Li Qiang. The U.S. president took numerous scheduled questions from the media, telling reporters that he was going to bed, although he kept answering additional questions, including his talk with Premier Lee at the G20 summit in India on Saturday. According to Biden, the talks with Lee were not confrontational at all.
We talked about at the conference overall. We talked about stability. We talked about making sure that the third world, the southern hemisphere had access to changes, had access. It wasn't confrontational at all.
Thank you, everybody. This ends the press conference. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
After attempting to answer another question, Biden turned around and walked off stage. This comes as many Democrats' concerns regarding the 80-year-old U.S. president's health. According to an NBC News survey in June of this year, 43% of Democrats said that they had moderate to major concerns about Biden's health. Meanwhile, reports say the U.S. president's press conferences are typically tightly managed by his aides. Biden's Vietnam trip came as the United States attempts to bolster ties with Asian countries in a bid to counter China's growing influence in the region. Reporting, this is Andrea Santos, SMNI News.
Sweden and Ukraine announced a plan to jointly produce combat vehicles to upgrade the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces. Kirby Hilton tells us more.
Ukraine and Sweden will jointly produce the Combat Vehicle 90, a family of Swedish track armored combat vehicles. Both sides aim to produce at least 1,000 CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles with better all-terrain performance and reinforced multi-layer armor. Ukrainian Deputy Minister of Defense Hanna Maliar described the modern combat vehicle as the best one in the world. The combat vehicle boasts effective anti-tank weapons and a powerful automatic 40mm gun, which can fire at a distance of up to 3 kilometers, and its maximum range is more than 12 kilometers. Ukraine's armed forces first received CV-90s in the summer of 2023, with the vehicles already performing combat missions on the front. In August, Sweden announced its 13th military support package to Ukraine worth $314 million and has provided a total of $1.6 billion since the start of the war. This has been Kirby Hilton, SMNI News.